Welcome to Asian Ethnology Podcast. My name is Ben Dorman and I'm the co-editor of Asian Ethnology. This episode's guest is Joy Hendry, emeritus professor of anthropology at Oxford Brookes University. Joy Hendry gave the keynote address at the Anthropologists of Japan in Japan conference held at Dorman University, Kyoto on the 9th of December 2017. The title of the talk was Classification as an Approach to Becoming, an old structural way of thinking about socialization. In our discussion, we talked about her initial research and the reasons why she undertook it. Joy, nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you too.
This talk was about education, your experiences of education, early education in Japan and the research that you did. Could you just talk a little bit about why you did this research and what you found out about?
I did it because I had small children myself, and I'd worked in Japan looking at general Japanese society, but also marriage, and wrote a thesis about that. And I thought it would be a good opportunity to come back to Japan and learn about how people bring up their children with my children. And I was really lucky because the Japan Foundation gave me a grant to do that, which surprised me, but it worked. And we spent 6 months living in next door to a kindergarten. So my older son, who was 4, was able to go to the kindergarten. My younger son was 1, and my next door neighbour had a son of 1, so I was in a really good position to do participant observation. Luckily, I found my doctor in Oxford had a daughter who wanted to come with us, and she helped me with the household work and also taught English in the kindergarten. So we were really part of the kindergarten community.
Did you have anything to compare it to, your experience?
Absolutely, yes. I was comparing it pretty much all the time with my own experience in the UK. So I talked to mothers about their preparation for having children in Japan and compared it with what I'd experienced in the UK. I talked to them about the follow-up care that they received after giving birth. I talked to them about their decisions with regard to things like toilet training, which was a really big issue in the UK at the time. People were discussing what they should and shouldn't do. And then I looked at the way that kindergartens are preparing children for the Japanese life, to become Japanese. That was the title. And I wrote, the book I wrote eventually was called Becoming Japanese. Right. I also looked at hoikuen, the nurseries, which have a different agenda in that they're, first of all, when they take very small children, they're not happy about it because they think they should be with their mothers until at least 1. But then they're also taking care of small children. So I looked at all that. All that early education is what I based my research and my talk on. So the talk was going right back. This was in 1981. And I published at the time, and I did a structural analysis based on my own training as an anthropologist, which has stood up to lectures over the years where, for example, I've been invited to lecture to cross-cultural psychology courses in my own university. And there'll be Japanese students in the class who'll come up at the end and say, oh yeah, I recognise all that, that's just what it was like.
Could you describe your understanding of what becoming Japanese is, based on what you learned?
When children are very small, they're addressed by their names. And one of the first things you want your child to do if you're in a Japanese situation is to respond to its name. So I listened to so many people going, Satoko-ya, or whatever the name was, and then the child would learn to respond to its name. But quite quickly, when you start having other children around, they become Oni-san or Nei-san, they take on a role.
Right.
So that early period is when people focus on the one person, the one little child, and give it all the attention it needs to make it happy. And another thing I mentioned is that Japanese babies are expected to be happy and good. And if they're not, it's because they're not getting the right attention. It's not their fault. As opposed to in Europe, and especially Catholic countries, where children are thought to be born with original sin, which you have to train them out of. So that was one big difference. Then when they start, they learn, and the big structural thing was they learn the difference between inside and outside. So they're inside their own home is one way of being, and when they cross the boundary and go outside, they've got to behave in a different way. And the way that's taught is by ritual. The socialization of this little biological being is to learn things like that distinction. So I showed a picture in the lecture of a genkan, and when kids come across that, from the minute they can walk, they know they've got to take their shoes off. They don't ever go over that. I've never seen a child go up into a house with its shoes on. And they'll stand crying to have someone come and get their shoes off rather than cross it. Then they have greetings that they say, and the greetings are fairly fixed, crossing that boundary. And then the clothes are changed, they clean their teeth, they gargle when they're inside. So you're cleaning off the outside dirt. So it's a dirt cleanliness thing, which is very structural. It's a distinction between dirt and cleanliness. And the ritual is associated with crossing the boundary.
Okay.
So that's the basis of the first part of my lecture, the distinction between inside and outside. And then when the children go to nursery or kindergarten, they become part of a group. And they're learning to be part of a group. Shudan seikatsu is what you're learning. So you still take your shoes off, but you're going into a group. And the two things that I heard people saying most to children about to enter one of these places was you're going to have lots of fun, be tanoshi, and you'll make lots of friends. Tomodachi ippai dekiru. So once they're in there, they're amongst friends, tomodachi, and they're all equal in the class. When they're tiny, the older children are expected to give in to the younger children. So the older children are told, you're older, so you know how to behave. And that younger child is still wagamama. Wagamama, mada, wakaranai, they don't understand. So you're actually giving the older child a responsibility really early, even if it's only 2. And my children, if they were meeting new children, always had to say exactly how old they were, so they would know how to address them. And the language, which is what I was observing, is different depending on whether you're talking up or down. So you come out of that hierarchical situation, not really hierarchical, it's just based on age, so who's older and who's younger, into a class where you're all equal. So in the classroom, the words that are used are things like minasan, it's everybody's class.
Right.
We must keep it clean, we must keep it nice, and it's because everybody's going to be in here together. And the teacher goes out of their way to make everything fun. So if you cooperate, and cooperation is really important, by doing what you're asked to do, by helping to hand out the break at a certain time, you share the duties. One of the things they did in the kindergarten where I lived was they took off their outdoor clothes and hung them up when they arrived. But the buttons are at the back, so they couldn't do them up by themselves. So everybody gets in a circle and does up the buttons of the person in front.
Okay.
So it's a really nice illustration of a cooperative thing. And then in the sports, they do things like tug of war, which is really cooperative. So you're learning to cooperate. So the structural thing that happened during the end of my lecture was I had a series of columns. Well, just 2 columns, but a series of entries with uchi and soto. And if you're going to be in the uchi in a kindergarten, you need to join in. You need to cooperate. And then you'll be tanoshi and you'll have fun. And if children who don't want to join in, they get ignored. So they're standing at the side, and I showed pictures of children standing at the side. Or I showed pictures of children drumming, and one little boy had been looking out of the window instead of focusing on his drumming. And the teacher said, would you like to go and play in the garden? He was really upset at that idea. And they brought him out to the front, and he stood by himself at the front with everybody else drumming. So you either join in and be part of what's going on, or you're outside. And the word used for a child who cries or doesn't want to participate is okashi. So you're strange.
Did the teachers use this word?
Yes, they did. And they said things like, come and join in. Be an onisan or an onesan.
Okay.
And if the child didn't join in, they just left them. So actually, in the end, in the kindergartens and nurseries, I observed pretty much all the children joined in because they got pretty bored standing outside. So that was my argument. And but I did say, and at the end I have a section in the lecture, and I had a section in my book about the personal qualities of the children. So every child is known personally to the kindergarten teachers. the teachers visit the homes of the children if they can, and they've got forms that the parents fill in about their details. So if the children are not joining in the way that they expect them to, then they can follow it up and try to help the child and do various things. Moreover, the children themselves know each other's skills and abilities. So outside in the playground, they know who's the fastest runner, they know who can climb, they know who's strong. So they've got all their distinctions, but it's just when they come in, they've got to put them on one side and be part of that inside group.
Yeah, it's interesting. What you're saying resonates with my own experience. And one thing I wanted to ask you about was, you mentioned that the children, I won't say required, but it's tanoshi. They've really got to enjoy themselves. When I speak to teachers at Hoikuin, they said that their role was to be this person who's bubbly, effervescent, always there, always for the children, and just be smiling all the time, no matter how they feel. And this was something that it struck me as being a kind of form that they really have to put on this coat of being a happy person. Did you experience that? Yes. Did you feel that?
Definitely. And moreover, it's the tatemai honne, which I haven't mentioned, but came up in the list of distinctions. And what the children learn really early is that if they want not to be bored at kindergarten, then they have to put on a tatemai of enjoying themselves as well, even if they're not. So the teacher's doing it, but the children, I think, do it as well. And the book by Kuroyanagi Tetsuko, which talks about the little girl looking out of the window, she talks in that book about how she didn't want to be part of it all. And she looked out the window because she would like to have gone out. But she realised she had to when she was there. And she actually talked to her parents who took her out of the kindergarten and put her in a different one. And Japanese people love that story. So I think it's evidence that that's what they do. They put on a front, the tatemai, and they play along. And most of them probably, I looked at my photographs when I was choosing some for the lecture, and they're not all having fun, actually. Some of them are looking quite fed up, but they go along with what they're supposed to do. And going along with what you're supposed to do is becoming Japanese, is what I argued. Okay. So the detail, you mentioned the detail that the teachers go into with the children. I've noticed that myself. They spend hours writing reports, visiting parents' homes, talking amongst themselves about the children, and they seem to be very, at least from my experience, they seem to be very responsive. Do you think that is a kind of key element in the Japanese system as you experienced it, as opposed to what you know from the UK? Yes, no, I do. Well, my children went to kindergarten in England as well, in Oxford, and they went to different ones, and the teachers took trouble to get to know them there. But there were big differences. So, for example, every child in the Japanese kindergarten has their own equipment, their own pencils, their own coloured things, their things to play with their names on.
And a hook for a bag and so on.
Yes, and a bag. Stuff, yes. And the bags are the same, except they've got something to distinguish them to be a personal thing. In the UK, they don't. They have all the equipment on the middle of the table, and children just help themselves play with it and put it back at the end. So they're sharing in a different way. And that was a big difference. And my son went back from Japan to England in Oxford to a nursery, and one of my friends whose son was there said, "Your son's trying to teach them all to be Japanese." So the poor kid was a bit, confused, but he was fine. I think it was a good experience because he learned different ways of doing things. My same son, when he was 4, who was the one who went to kindergarten when he was 4, went to school. And when we went back, and he was in the 4th year, so he couldn't really write. He could speak, could play football.
So when you came back to Japan?
When we came back to Japan to do further research, he was in a class with a teacher so he couldn't fit in. He couldn't write what the other children could do by the time they were 4th years. He could do maths approximately, and he could play football. But he was a real misfit in that class. That teacher was absolutely wonderful in calling me in to help me work out if he had a problem. So he had a problem with somebody who's exchanging pencils, and the pencil broke, and she called me in and explained the way they exchange things. I said he shouldn't borrow other people's pencils, and she said, "Oh no, that's part of what we do. We exchange pencils, and if it breaks, then it's just unfortunate, but So that kind of thing. It's just one example, but she was very caring and took trouble to try and get him to fit in, even though he was clearly a misfit by that time.
That's interesting because, I mean, a lot of the things that I hear about is, at least from the Hoikoen teachers who I speak to, is that they notice that children have certain issues that, with socialization, problems with communication and so on, but they don't quite know how to communicate it to the parents. And so probably, I'm assuming from what you've described, is that the teacher probably saw he was being open enough to discuss those issues. Whereas I think, from what I've seen, the teachers have to be fairly choosy about how they approach the parents and how they, how they present this issue and how they're going to go about it. So it seems to be because of parental denial, I guess, and parents wanting their children to be in a particular way is what I've seen.
Actually, you asked me about special needs. It's the school that's changed. So when I put my children's names down to go to the Japanese school locally, the nearest school to where we were living, they said, no, they should go to a different school because it's got a class for children with special needs. And because they didn't speak Japanese, or, they couldn't fit into the Japanese system, they wanted them to go there. And I said I'd rather they went to the local one with the neighbours, which is apparently now what children are much more likely to do, even if they have special needs. So that's the change.
Yeah, and now the government have introduced special needs classes in the schools, and they're training a system to train people who are special needs assistants, I guess, at the school. Tokubetsu Shien Kyoiku is what it's called. And it seems that they're, depending on the school, our local school is kind of, the ordinary classes are full of students with, and there are students in there who have special needs but are not identified as having special needs, whereas the special needs class is a very small number. There's actually 2 teachers for 5 students. That's kind of it. Yeah, so there's clearly an awareness of that now. It's changing. Joy Hendry, thank you very much for your time.
Well, thank you for asking me.
My name is Ben Dorman, and you've been listening to Asian Ethnology Podcast. You can subscribe to Asian Ethnology Podcast on iTunes or iHeartRadio.